Let me first thank Asian Network and the Nordic Institute of Asian Studies in Copenhagen for organizing this event. Unfortunately, I didn't bring the nice book. I only brought the boring book or version of the book. So, but this is then a book launch for this volume, South Asian Sovereignty, The Conundrum of Wordly Power, edited by David Gilmartin, Pamela Price, and myself. Now I'll get to the program for today. Just let me first, I'll just say a few words about how this book came about. It comes out of a workshop we organized on the retirement of Pamela Price, held at Oslo University in December 2013. So it's been quite a while. The workshop was called Why History? On the relevance of cultural history for the study of contemporary South Asia. It's organized by Lars Thor Flåten, Ute Hysken, and myself. It tried to investigate the importance of cultural history to the understanding of dynamics of historical development in South Asian state formation, something that Pamela had worked on for a substantial portion of her productive intellectual life. And it was in appreciation of her tremendous contribution to the field that we organized that workshop and to her scholarship on South Asia in the Nordic region. So, Pamela, this is for you again. So this volume here comes out of that workshop. Some of the contributors to, or the participants to that workshop joined us for the volume. Some did not, and a few were added later on. It's been a very long process. It took ages. From the workshop to the volume published last year. We spent a lot of time trying to figure out exactly how to focus it. And I'm very happy to acknowledge the role that David Gilmartin played in this and the focus on sovereignty, which I think has been very fruitful, and which sort of pinpointed a very important debate that we've had, that we could address with this volume. And of course, we're happy to have David with us today. And as the one of the editors and the author of the introductory chapter, David will give us a few, we'll talk about the book, basically, talk about the book. David, I'll just introduce him briefly. David is a distinguished professor at Department of History at North Carolina State University in the United States. His research interests have focused on the intersections of British India and the development of modern politics and forms of rule. His 2015 book called Blood and Water, the Indus River Basin in Modern History, analyzes environmental and political history over the last 200 years. His current research focuses on the legal history of India's electoral institutions as they've evolved from its colonial past, and on the ways these institutions have reflected evolving visions of sovereignty. It's also pertinent for today's event that he has published on voting, people's sovereignty. He has an article called Rethinking the Public Through the Lens of Sovereignty, and also an article on global history of voting. I'm very happy to have David here. He has been on my reading list since I started reading Indian history at university. And so I'm mightily impressed by him and always have been. So he will give a 15 minutes introduction, 15 minutes or thereabouts. And then we're lucky to have two commentators. First, we have Duncan McCargo, who is serving now as director of the Nordic Institute of Asian Studies and also is a professor of political science at the University of Copenhagen. McCargo, Duncan, has published several books on Thailand, on press, newspapers, judiciary, including just launched last month, was it? Maybe June, Fighting for Virtue, a study of its judiciary and the world of Thai judges and how they are recruited and trained and promoted and socialized into the conservative world view that emphasizes proximity of judiciary and the monarchy, published by Cornell University Press this year. He also has written extensively on the violent conflict in Thailand's southern borders, including a research monograph, Tearing Apart the Land, on Islam and legitimacy in southern Thailand, and the follow-up, Mapping National Anxieties in 2012. I'll just mention, because it's so fun, that Tearing Apart the Land has been widely reviewed, and Time magazine wrote about it, that this is not an armchair's author. He researched the book by crisscrossing southern Thailand in a temperamental 1989 Mercedes, hasting back to the town of Patani by nightfall to avoid militant booby traps. McCargo is the real McCoy. What more can you say? What more can you say? So anyway, second commentator is Eren Topal, who is currently a Marie Curie postdoctoral fellow at our Department for Culture Studies and Oriental Languages. And his research project is Messianic Conceptions of Politics and Authoritarianism in Turkey, 1850 to 2015. And he has a PhD from Bilkent University in Political Science with the dissertation From Decline to Progress on Ottoman Concepts of Reform. And his research is broadly concerned with revisionist history of Ottoman Turkish political thought through the longue durée study of key concepts. He's also interested in questions of modernization, secularization, identity, tradition, etc. The current project aims to trace how messianic conceptions of time and politics inform authoritarian leadership and legitimation processes in Turkey. Very interesting project, and Alp has repeatedly impressed us with his the scale of his knowledge. Anyways, so each commentator will have 15 minutes each. And after the comments, David will have a few minutes to respond to the issues raised, and then we will have a Q&A session. Let's just leave the floor to David for his introduction, the floor or the screen as it is. Yeah. Okay, so David, all yours.
I want to, before we start, thank both Arild and Pamela Price, my co-editors. I wrote the introduction to the volume, but both Arild and Pamela have articles in it and very much contributed to the many discussions that we had on this. And without them, the volume, I don't think, would have come out. So thank you. And I also want to thank all the contributors before we start. And I noticed that several of them are here, and I can't see everybody, so I'm not absolutely certain, but Uwe Skoda and Asper Moin and Aya Ikegami I've seen. So that's great. And I hope that in the questions, that will give people some opportunity to talk to them about their contribution. So I just want to say a few words of background about this and about the problem of doing a book about sovereignty. So sovereignty is a subject, as Arild noted, that there's been quite a bit of interest in and a lot of writing on in recent years. It's a very old subject, but it's been written on in a lot of new ways over the last 20 years, but more recently than that, a lot of work has come out on sovereignty. The central problem on sovereignty, of course, is that no one can agree on exactly what it is or what it means. You find all kinds of different definitions, and this in part is specific to different disciplines which have their own literatures on sovereignty, but it's not simply a disciplinary problem. It's a very difficult term to nail down. And that problem is compounded in the context of writing on South Asian sovereignty, because in fact, the term sovereignty is very difficult to translate into most South Asian languages. So there are terms which are translated as sovereignty, but in many contexts, there is no term that exactly captures the mix of things that we've tried to address under the rubric sovereignty. And just to get at this, because this reflects something that is important to the way we've approached it, is that the translations, the problem with translating sovereignty is that the terms that are used tend toward either of two sides of a spectrum, and one side is rule, and there are of course plenty of terms dealing with rule. I mean, just thinking of Urdu, which is the language I'm most familiar with it. There, a term like hukumat, meaning rule, can be translated, sometimes is translated as sovereignty. That's kind of one end of the spectrum, but the other end is terms that tend more toward a meaning of autonomy, that is of a power that is not influenced by something else, but is the ultimate source of will and authority. So a term in Urdu like khud mukhtari is sometimes translated as sovereignty. That's a term which could be used relating to governance, or it could be used more commonly actually relating to individual positioning. So what we have done is to take this term sovereignty and really focus on what seems to be a fundamental, as we've called it, conundrum at the root of sovereignty. That is, suggesting that the term, rather than referring to a clear-cut thing, is something that really captures attention, a conundrum, a problem in the nature of rule. And at the root of that problem is precisely this distinction between rule as order and control versus rule as a legitimate claim to power linked into the forces that define the universe more broadly. So, I mean, at the root of that, one could say, are questions of legitimacy, but the key problem, and here in the introduction, I sort of opened with a kind of discussion of the work of Jan Heesterman, which is really rooted in ancient India, but he's written things which bring this up into more modern times, but he gets at this by projecting something which he calls, in a quite well-known article done many, many years ago, the conundrum of the king's authority. And the fundamental conundrum of the king's authority, as he tells it, although it's a more complicated argument than I'll give it credit for here, but the fundamental conundrum of the king's authority is that to effectively exercise sovereignty, the king must at once be a part of the community that he rules, and at the very same time stand apart from that community. And the reason for that is the rule of the king, on the one hand, derives from the encapsulation through the ruler of the notion of the community as a whole as a unity, which requires a vision of the community that transcends the divisions, the politics, the social stratification, the hierarchies which define any community, but yet at the same time must, to effectively rule, bring order by deeply engaging in that community and managing all of these divisions, which can only be done by deep immersion into the community itself. So this gets at what's at the heart of the argument about sovereignty that the book attempts to address. And that is that sovereignty always has these two sides to it. And yet its fundamental conundrum is that these are always in tension. That the one inevitably tends to challenge the other. Because to be in a community and apart from the community is, of course, in some ways, an impossible situation. So that's why it's a conundrum. Both things have to be the case at the same time. So that, and this is another basic argument of the book, this is a conundrum with deep roots in South Asia, which go back well before the modern period or the colonial period, which is the focus of the articles in this book. So however much we can try to demonstrate and argue about how colonialism shaped the nature of sovereignty in South Asia, which in some ways all of the articles in the book suggest, as does the introduction to the book suggest, but nevertheless to say that does not in any way deny that the fundamental conundrum which we define as at the root of sovereignty is much older and precedes this and is deeply embedded in Indian culture long before the era of colonialism. So this is another sort of central engagement of the book, which is that to talk about sovereignty in South Asia, we want to simultaneously try to engage with the way sovereignty has taken distinctly South Asian forms and has shaped South Asian politics and conceptions of power and rule in distinctive ways, and yet argue at exactly the same time that the basic tensions of sovereignty which we talk about in South Asia are in no way peculiar to South Asia, that they exist all over the world. And if we start out with Heistermann, who wrote on ancient India, in fact, one could get at these in many forms in other parts of the world, starting out with other people who have written about what looks very similar to this conundrum in other parts of the world. And one clear example of that, which that I make some reference to in the introduction, is the quite well-known work of Ernst Kantorowicz, focused on the concept of the king's two bodies in medieval European and early modern European conceptions of sovereignty, which of course is again a different framing, but an expression of the same idea. The one body is immortal, transcends the social and the political. The other is mortal and embedded in the political structure of society. So this is, again, just a different way of looking at this. So that's one key point. This is about South Asian sovereignty, but at the same time, not really just about South Asia. It's about basic dynamics of sovereignty, which are not in any way peculiar to South Asia. But the second point to argue about the basic framing of the book is that it's about the modern period, but the argument is that even though sovereignty has taken different forms in the modern period, and that's what a lot of the essays in the book try to illustrate, but it's, again, there's nothing in this basic structure that's peculiarly modern. So one of the points of the book is precisely to argue that on one level there is something new when we talk about the 19th and the 20th centuries in the colonial period in India, but on the other hand, there is no kind of massive break when it comes to issues of sovereignty or popular conceptions of rule between what we could call a modern period and a pre-modern period. There's significant continuity across that line. So in any case, that's the basic, the big concerns of the book. And so just to say a couple things, I don't want to go on too long on this, and Arild, I hope will cut me off if I go more than 15 minutes. But the question then is, what the book focuses on are what are the modern forms of sovereignty. That is, the book focuses on the 19th and the 20th centuries. So we're looking at the colonial period and the post-1947 period, primarily in India, but also in Pakistan and in Bangladesh. And so what I suggest in the introduction, and these terms may not be the best ones to use on this, but I think they capture what we're trying to get at. The two conceptions of sovereignty that in the introduction tries to lay out are the nature of sovereignty during the colonial period, which I've argued is cast in terms of something that could be called the sovereignty of reason. And here the term reason is problematic, and I'm well aware of that. But on the other hand, I think it captures something important, so I want to say a word about that. But then secondly, the question of the sovereignty of the people, which in fact is very much rooted in the same ideas as the sovereignty of reason, but nevertheless takes these in a new direction. So starting out, what do we mean by the sovereignty of reason? So the sovereignty of reason, and this takes us back to these questions about translating sovereignty. The sovereignty of reason is rooted in the idea of reason, not as rationality per se. So I really want to distance it from that idea, but rather from the idea of a fundamental human autonomy, of a fundamental human autonomous consciousness, which is captured, and here this concept comes out of the Enlightenment, this idea of reason as an expression of what makes humans human. That is the core of a kind of human autonomy and will. And this is the conception of reason that lies behind 19th century colonialism. That is that there is this idea of human beings having this fundamental autonomy, which then provides the framework for the touchstones of legitimate rule. And this is embodied in the 19th century in the development of international law, in the notion that states need to have certain attributes. And this is kind of central to the ultimate vision that lies behind colonial sovereignty. But having said that, as I'm sure everyone is well aware, that conception of sovereignty was continuously in tension with the other side, the conundrum of worldly authority, in which this vision of sovereignty was also related to the establishment of order, which is necessary to allow this vision of reasoned state authority to function. And this became critically linked in the 19th century, and this again has older roots, in this idea that the cultivation of reason, that is autonomy, was part of a process where the model, and this goes back to the Enlightenment, the model was the maturation of the individual person. And this goes back to Locke and many other European thinkers, the idea that people are not born with reason, they're born with the capacity for reason, which then is developed, so that this whole vision of reasoned autonomy is one of process. And this vision of the individual was projected in international law in the 19th century into this vision of certain societies, certain cultures having reached a higher stage of reason. So this was the great, Karuna Montana calls the alibi of empire, that the rulers of empire justified their rule by claiming that they had reached a higher stage of reason than the people that they were ruling. So they, in the interests of order, it was necessary to use violence, to use many forms of concrete power in order to maintain authority. And so the justification for this, which again many people have written on, was the notion that sovereignty in this sense was an act of becoming. And the peoples of the colonized world, as again, theorists of international law, and many people, I'm thinking though particularly of Anthony Angi's book, lays out the idea that the Europeans, as having reached this stage, had the right of recognition, so that the autonomy of states which had not reached this stage could be readily violated by European empires in the name of ultimately creating the conditions where movement toward this kind of reasoned vision of sovereignty could develop. So, this is the great conundrum of colonial rule, which was that it continuously asserted a justification for rule linked to this universalizing principle of reason, which was the key to the universe because it was the key to human consciousness, but that this was continuously compromised in practice by the way that states actually behave. And the way this was justified was in terms of this vision of a process of becoming. So, as I said in the introduction, some people have written about this system as a system of, Stephen Krasner has called it organized hypocrisy. That is constant tension between the principles that are put forward to justify rule, the civilizing mission of the Europeans, versus the reality of what's going on. So one could well argue that this is central to sovereignty, that this tension manifests itself in terms of the conundrum of worldly rule, manifests itself in terms of the need for this sort of hypocrisy. And I don't think that's wrong. I think that's quite general in terms of sovereignty and how it operates. But having said that, I would also suggest this is not a peculiarly 19th century phenomenon. That is, you would find this in earlier visions as well. In fact, you'd find it in Hastermann's vision of the conundrum of the king's authority, that the king must constantly be projecting a vision of his connection to the forces that justify rule, which involves, renouncing worldly power in certain ways, even as worldly power has to be continuously used in order to maintain order. So it is organized hypocrisy, but this is not a strictly European phenomenon by any means. And here's where one key thing that I wish to get at here is that this form of hypocrisy or of compromise would be another way of putting it. This conundrum of worldly power, it plays out in many different actual forms of rule. So there is an underlying vision of the ultimate roots of sovereignty that the British colonial state, at least in India, but I think in most places, brings. But yet, the way that is played out is continuously in interaction with a kind of pragmatic notion of what's necessary to maintain order, which also involves serving European economic interests. So many scholars have written about forms of sovereignty like, quasi-sovereignty or partial sovereignty or shared sovereignty. And I think that all actually gets at something that's really important. But having said that, none of these are really forms of sovereignty. They're forms of the way that these two different sides to the conundrum of worldly rule play out. And there's always a larger vision of sovereignty, an ultimate vision, which lies behind those worldly forms. So moving on to the sovereignty of the people, which certainly with respect to India, one does have some writing on this in the late 19th century, but it's really a phenomenon of the 20th century when this becomes a major issue. But the sovereignty of the people, basically, one could say, grows out of this same conundrum one finds in the sovereignty of reason, but rather is a way sort of out of one aspect of this conundrum by arguing that the people themselves, rather than having been consigned to a never-ending act of becoming, always immature, the sovereignty of the people is an idea that asserts the maturity of the people as a foundation for rule. So there are forms of the sovereignty of people which maintain this act of becoming. And certainly one can see that in interesting ways, for example, in the thinking of Nehru, who very much stressed the importance of the sovereignty of the people, but also stressed that the people were always in an act of becoming, and the state had to take on a kind of form of pedagogy to train people toward the ultimate realization of their own sovereignty. So this does, this idea of the people sort of becoming sovereign doesn't go away, even among some people who overtly assert the concept of the sovereignty of the people, like Nehru. But nevertheless, the sovereignty of the people is a bit different from what's embedded in the sovereignty of reason, but it contains the same contradiction again. One could argue that the sovereignty of the people, and people have argued this, that the sovereignty in people embodies the same dilemmas one finds, for example, in Kantorovic's view of the king's two bodies. That is, the sovereign people inevitably also have two bodies. The one is a kind of unified body, abstracted from social conflict, abstracted from everyday politics, in fact, abstracted from social structure to create the imagining of a unified people who could be sovereign. But that is always contrasted with the other body of the people, which could be called society, which is the body of the people which is marked by inevitable social conflict, critique, argument. And again, these are always in tension. So that's a kind of just rough outline of what the introduction argues for the book, and then in the substantive chapters, we've divided the book in 3 sections. The first one looks primarily at law, but also at the relationship of law to religion and to the state. The second one looks at kingship in modern India and how ideas of kingship have been transformed. And the last, looking at the concept of the nation and the sovereign imagination, that is, the ways that the concept of the nation embodies these tensions that we've already just talked about with respect to the people. So I don't want to go through a discussion of each of the papers, because many of the authors are here and they could do this much better than I could, and we could in the discussion. But just for those of you who have not actually read the book, I just want to briefly describe what each of the contributions is about, and then we could open it up for discussion. Comments first and then discussion. So the first section deals with the critical question of law and sovereignty. So this is, again, absolutely central. Law is a classic manifestation as a general concept of this, this conundrum of worldly authority, because law, the legitimacy of law, like sovereignty in general, the legitimacy of law depends on its simultaneously claiming an authority that transcends politics, so that the idea of the impartiality of the law is a critical conceit in legitimizing the law's authority. But yet, of course, in actual operation, the law is enmeshed in social conflicts and politics. And in fact, it's one of the remarkable things about law and the history of law is that law has continued to maintain this, to embody within itself this conundrum, that is, the idea of the impartiality of the law has hardly gone away, even though the actual study of the law has demonstrated, in massive form, the degree to which the law is shot through with politics and pressures of all sorts. And so that's a critical question to get at with the law. And one thing that several of the papers in this section do, and this is particularly the case with Aya Kagame's paper, is to stress that one aspect of the maintenance of this idea of the impartiality of the law is the association of the law and its practitioners, that is, with judges, with a kind of almost ascetic self-denial, that the impartiality of the law is rooted in the idea that judges, even though they have their own prejudices, they inevitably have a social position. They belong to a class, they belong to an ethnic group, but their ability to serve as judges is rooted in one could say in the most extreme presentation of this, by a sort of heroic self-denial, an attempt to be wholly impartial in judging this. And as Aya argues in looking at a guru who performs this role, this of course is closely linked with all kinds of religious ideas rooted in the power of self-denial. And so that's a really interesting element of this to explore, and very important in the context of India. I think this notion of the connections between the law and asceticism and self-denial as a valued cultural vision.
David,
yes.
David, as much as I hate to cut you short, do you think you could sort of start thinking about wrapping it up?
I could. I actually could. So I don't want to, as I said, go through all the papers, but just to say Pam Price's paper looks much more directly at how the law operates in controlling religious institutions and how it relates and itself tries to take account of these issue of renunciation and self-denial in religious leaders. In the second section on kingship, Uwe Skoda, Caleb Simmons, Lucia Micheluti, all of them deal with the embodiment of sovereignty in individuals and how the contradictions are played out. Again, the ruler as outsider versus the ruler as part of the community in different sorts of contexts. And then the last two papers deal explicitly with the nation and the sovereign imagination on Azfar Moeen's on Pakistan and on the attack on the Ahmadi community in Pakistan as a framework for asserting a certain vision of sovereignty and a certain definition of its roots in Pakistan, and Arild's paper on a film in Bangladesh, a Bollywood film, and how it's received in Bangladesh, suggesting the problem of sovereign autonomy in a society which is very much influenced by cultural flows coming from a very large and often annoying neighbor. That would be India. So let me stop there, Arild. I'm sorry if I've gone on a little long, and we can go from there.
Okay, David, I didn't want to cut you short because it's always so interesting to listen to you. But
no, it's fine. You could have cut me off at any time.
no. But in the interest also of timekeeping generally,
please,
and to allow some time for Duncan, Alp, and then questions and answers. There are issues here that we'll come back to. Thank you, David, for your introduction. I'll leave the floor now to Duncan. Please, Duncan, all yours.
Okay, thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I'm very pleased that NIAS was able to co-sponsor and organize this event. I have got the book with the nice picture on the cover, which is very dramatic, and I received this a few weeks ago, and I was wondering why, as a Southeast Asia person by orientation, I was being sent this book and asked to join this event. But very quickly, after starting to read it, and especially David's masterful introduction to the key concepts that underpin the book, I realized that there was something going on here that resonated very much with work that I've been doing. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Thailand, which is slightly off topic, but I think what I'm doing there is demonstrating precisely that this is not just a book about Southeast Asia, that the questions about worldly power and conundrums loom very large. So the conundrum of Siamese worldly power, if we want to call it that, is actually being acted out on Thai streets virtually every night over the past few weeks since I received the book. So this turns out to be incredibly timely. There are all these protests that are taking place in Thailand, many of them led by students emerging on campuses, even high schools and public spaces around the country. And actually what all these protests are about is this question of sovereignty. And a key dilemma to be resolved here: is Thailand a country that operates under rule of law based on popular sovereignty, or does the king, even to this day, enjoy sovereign privileges that transcend the constitution, despite the fact that the absolute monarchy was supposedly abolished in 1932? So we go right to the heart of the issue here. So Siam, as most people will know, was never formally colonized. We can debate exactly what happened, but to cut a long story short, Bangkok colonized the rest of the country, sending out bureaucrats from the capital city to bring the rest of the country under control, establishing borders, asserting sovereignty, subordinating minority peoples and troublesome elements to central power. And in doing that, Siam also brought in quite a lot of foreigners to help craft this modern-looking state. So there's an attempt to create a semblance of a modern-looking state, precisely as part of a project to stop the perfidious British and the equally perfidious French from getting their hands on this territory. So the absolute monarchy tried to fake a modern state, as it were, brought in lots of people to help them. The Danes were brought in to create a navy, and British were used as financial advisors, Americans as foreign advisors, foreign policy advisors. So there was a lot of international involvement in this project, but ultimately it was a project designed to keep foreigners in their place and foreigners out. So what was really going on there, I'm able to reimagine this in a new way after looking at the book, was on some level to preserve the absolute monarchy alongside these outward trappings of rationality and modernity, the reason-based sovereignty. But how far was reason-based sovereignty really what was going on here? It's certainly an incompletely successful project, because as in South Asia, you've got these exercises of organized hypocrisy on a grand scale. You're trying to look as though you've introduced popular sovereignty, when actually it's an attempt to preserve space in which absolute monarchy can retain authority. So even after 1932, when the absolute monarchies ended, there has been a continuous attempt over the past almost 90 years to reassert the power of monarchy and sovereignty of the monarch over the political order. So the students who are out on the streets have been demanding three things: the revision of a troublesome constitution drafted under the auspices of a military junta that took power in 2014 and in many ways still has power, although there was an election last year. Power passed into the hands of the same people who've been running the country during the coup period. The dissolution of parliament and an end to harassment of protesters and activists. So the students' demands, on the face of it, seem to be directed at this rational project. However, it's all turned out to be a little bit more complicated than that, not least because on the 10th of August, and the number 10 is very important here, on the 10th of August, a certain group of students at Thammasat University opened up a new front in their challenges to the center, and they laid out 10 new demands. At the core of the 10 new demands are the reform of the monarchy, and these demands are directed specifically at the new king who assumed the throne at the end of 2016, Rama X. So it's the untenability of the reign of Rama X, which is the primary focus of the radical core of these students' demands. They can dress it up if they talk about constitutional reform. That's all very respectable, and that's all very fine. But once they start talking about extra constitutional power and the capacity of the monarchy to continue to intervene politically in the direction of the Thai state, then they're going into very dangerous territory. There are lèse-majesté laws. You can't talk about this stuff in Thailand without potentially being arrested. All kinds of difficulties start to follow. So the new king assumed the throne, as I said, in late 2016. His father, King Bhumibol, was on the throne for 70 years, from 1946. He was widely credited with overseeing the political order and the socioeconomic transformation of Thailand during a period of growth, and even a restoration of ideas of democracy during his reign at various junctures. There's a stark contrast with the positive image that Rama IX had, and the very different image of his son, Rama X. So what Rama IX did was rarely make any direct interventions in the political process. He would work through proxies, created a structure which I've called Network Monarchy. This is by far my most notorious article. It still forms the basis of a lot of people's arguments and disagreements, even though I wrote it 15 years ago. Can we still talk about this idea of network monarchy? So what happens in a network monarchy is you have a monarch who doesn't come out in public very often and doesn't make very many overt interventions in the political process. However, around the monarch, there are these people who we might want to term proxies, although proxies is a very laden word. Members of the Privy Council, senior military officers, judges, even members of civil society, academics, journalists, friends of mine, friends of ours, people that we might interact with very readily if we go and engage in discourse in Thailand. Some of those people would see themselves as acting on behalf of monarchy, which doesn't mean that they received any direct instructions or even had ever any communication from the palace. How to explain this? Students were asking me again on Monday when I was teaching about this subject. What do I mean by network monarchy? I usually have the analogy of a cup of coffee, which is perhaps a little bit cryptic, but I have a cup of coffee on my table when I'm teaching, and I say, where did this cup of coffee come from? Well, the answer is that I went and got it from somewhere. I either went and bought the coffee across the road when I was teaching in Leeds, or the other day in Copenhagen, I went back to my office and made it. And then I would ask the students, what week of the semester is it? If we find that we're several weeks into the semester and I'm still bringing the cup of coffee, what does that tell us about our power relations? This tends to puzzle students in Western countries, but when I taught in China and other places, they would be able to answer this question immediately. Indeed, when I taught in China, after the first class, the cup of coffee would appear by itself. It was not necessary for the professor to go and procure his own coffee, nor was it necessary for the professor to indicate to the students the expectation that the coffee should be brought. The coffee would appear. I think this is an analogy for the concept of network monarchy. It was not necessary for the late king to say anything about what he wanted to happen. At a certain point, the people working in his network would understand that the time had come for a particular politician to be removed from office, that a military coup should be staged. Thailand's had more military coups than any other country in the world in recent decades, that a particular politician should be banned from office or their party dissolved. King did not have to say anything about this stuff in order for it to happen. And this, I think, is where the question about the exercise of sovereignty becomes very interesting. Where is the agency in a system like this? The king is able to maintain this myth that he's a Dharma Raja, a benevolent monarch exercising these 10 royal virtues and this Buddhistic concept. But this is a way of floating above the fray, which occludes the real dynamics of power that are in operation here, the conundrum and the slightly baffling internal workings of what goes on behind the curtain. I've got to admit I was partly inspired by Carol van Wolfram's classic book, The Enigma of Japanese Power, 1989, where van Wolfram talks about how it's impossible in the Japanese concept to work out where power really lies. Bureaucrats will say it's with politicians, politicians will say it's with bureaucrats. People in the private sector and the large companies will say that it's nothing to do with them. Other people will point the finger and say that they are giving all the cues and scripts to both the politicians and the bureaucrats. This is the very interesting sort of model that we're working on here. Of course, van Wolfram was criticized for orientalizing and essentializing the nature of Japanese power. You could argue that the kind of concept I've advanced about Thailand suffers from the same kinds of problems. But nevertheless, there's no doubt that there's a very deep cultural resonance in this sort of idea. Since the dawn of the new reign, the new king has not been waiting for the cup of coffee to appear by itself. It's fairly clear that he's been giving instructions as to what should happen. It's hard to see him as a Dharma Raja. He doesn't have any qualms about exercising power, for example, issuing an edict that led to the banning of an opposition political party in the middle of the election that took place in 2019. But he's living abroad. He is making selected interventions into the political life of the country that he literally oversees by CCTV. And that's a completely new concept of kingly sovereignty. You don't actually have to be in the kingdom in order to exercise power over it. It's rather Foucauldian. So reactions to these student protests are extremely divided. Most politicians and social actors, and I've talked to a lot of them actually over the past couple of weeks on Zoom calls and things, they're trying to tone down these demands and get everything back to the question of the constitution, because Thailand's had more constitutions than any other country in the world over the past 100 years as well. Reforming the constitution is something that Thailand's very comfortable with. It's an easy solution to every problem, except possibly it's not really the solution to every or any problem, because if you believe that extra constitutional power that's invisible is undermining and sabotaging anything that's done in the more visible and manifest political realm, then you could change the constitution in any number of ways and not get to the core of this problem. And that's why some of the students are saying enough is enough. We have to stop talking about just amending the constitution and find out, what we can really do about this, the true sovereignty problem, the hidden exercise of power, and the unannounced return of some of the ideas behind absolute monarchy that have been creeping back in, especially over the past few years or so. We've also seen the literal removal of monuments to the People's Party that carried out the 1932 end of absolute monarchy, and an attempt to erase the history of much of what happened in Thailand in the 1930s and 40s. So what's going to happen? Kingly power remains the problem. We don't know how this impasse can be resolved, but it's extremely interesting to me that so many of the ideas that are talked about in this book are coming to the fore on the streets of Thailand now. We're going to have another big demonstration on the 19th of September. And how precisely this problem can be resolved remains unclear, but it's absolutely the case that this conundrum of worldly power, slightly recast in a specifically Thai context, the same issues and the same fundamental questions and concepts that are talked about in this book are highly resonant to understanding what's going on in Thailand. So the next article I write, I'm going to try to apply some of the ideas in this book to precisely the things I'm talking about now. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Duncan. Very, very interesting. Of course, Thailand and South Asia are completely different planets in one way, but I think it's extremely interesting to see that you find this useful and sort of confirm David's point that this is not just something specific to South Asia, but it's a universal thing. But I'm getting ahead of myself because now we'll have a comment from our Middle East scholar. And I don't know, maybe the world is different there after all. So I don't know. Alp, please.
Thanks, Arild. I would like to thank first to Arild for including me in this and giving me the opportunity to present my take among such distinguished scholars. And of course, I would thank the authors and the editors above all, because I mean, I have been inspired so much by this volume with regard to my own research. I will do something similar to Duncan and start with a short maybe anecdote from Turkey that I think brings out really well the conundrums of worldly power and the persistence of traditional themes in Turkish or in general Middle Eastern politics. Some of you may have followed this. It was kind of an international incident when 2 months ago Erdogan, current Turkish President Erdogan, decided to turn Hagia Sophia, the 1500-year-old Byzantine monument in Istanbul, into a mosque, which had been turned into a mosque in 16th century when Istanbul was conquered by Mehmed II. But in early Republican era in 1930s, it had been turned into a museum by the general decision of Turkish Parliament. this had been a major topic among conservative Turkish voters, reinstatation of Hagia Sophia as a mosque. It had highly symbolic value, and Erdogan eventually did it. And of course, it came together with all sorts of rituals, including a huge Friday prayer 1 month ago in Hagia Sophia, led by Erdogan himself, attended by almost 400,000 people who came from all over Anatolia amidst a raging corona pandemic situation. What many people following the situation have missed, interestingly, is that instead of just doing this by a presidential decree, which Erdogan is very used to by now, ruling by presidential decrees, he somehow decided to set a legal precedent. So the early Republican decision to convert Hagia Sophia into a museum was overturned by the Court of Appeals, the Supreme Court of Appeals, as in violation of Mehmet II's legal rights. This sounds a bit weird, I understand, I assume, but the thing is, basically the Hagia Sophia was a pious foundation, a waqf. I think you know the waqf system, most of you here. But all the Ottoman legal precedents had been annulled by the institution of republic. This dynasty had been abolished completely by 1924. So by citing a pre-republican legal precedent as a cause, as a reason for turning Hagia Sophia back into a mosque, basically Turkish Court of Appeals made a very dangerous precedent, which will probably be followed by many others. I think this single incident, bears in it a lot of the problems that are dealt with by the scholars in this volume. And of course, there is the obvious question of Erdogan's aspirations for caliphate. Of course, it is again a conundrum for him because although he is aspiring to be a caliph and the possibility of institution of a caliphate or bringing back the caliphate is being actively discussed on Turkish television and media, of course, no one really approaches the question of the practical implications. I mean, how would it work? Erdogan would never do away with elections, so would caliph be elected? What if a woman is elected to presidency? Would she be able to be caliph? Would there be a succession system? These are not approached, but the question of caliphate, or the shadow of the question of caliphate, reigns supreme over Turkish politics presently. Time will tell how it will turn out. Yes, I mean, this is the conundrum of Turkish politics, basically. The tension between a decidedly secularized and rational system of governments in the last 150 years and extra-legal aspirations which carry highly divergent temporal and messianic projections. So that's why the book, this edited volume, was highly inspirational for me. It gave me so many ideas regarding how to frame my own questions and how to approach this problem of messianic authority that is looming in the horizon. But as a reflection on the central question of sovereignty, on which David Gilmartin has so brilliantly explored, I think it is actually, I mean, the problem, the the vagueness, the difficulty of talking about sovereignty or approaching it or studying it is not, I think it points to other directions, or it implies other sorts of problems that I think the question of sovereignty or approaching sovereignty actually solves. The vagueness of the question, I think, mirrors some of the vocabulary or terminology we have in comparative political science that are increasingly falling short of understanding such phenomena globally. I mean, we talk about, of course, institutions, practices, formal or informal institutions, democratization processes, formal procedures, constitutions, setups, whatever. But these are, I mean, these are increasingly falling short. I mean, it's not just, of course, Middle East or South Asian politics. I mean, what we define as, you know, authoritarian backlash, which is happening all over the world, from United States to South America to Eastern Europe, Middle East. I mean, we all kind of feel that the things might be changing very fast, and the vocabulary, the current vocabulary we have, the current theories, approaches we have might be insufficient. And sovereignty, especially the way it is dealt in this volume, in the long drain, not just as a contemporary modern problem, but that reaches back several centuries, if not millennia, I think captures this problem really well, because it reminds us that we need to, especially to us political scientists, that we need to step back from a detailed analysis, very highly detailed and statistical analysis of contemporary problems, and approach this from in a more historical fashion, tracing long-running trajectories and understanding. So I think the vagueness or the problems or difficulties with the concept of sovereignty are actually an advantage here that we should explore even further and maybe come up with more elaborate and nuanced categories, analytical categories and terminology that is suited to exploring this emerging phenomena. And also another problem that we are facing as political scientists increasingly, I think, is that temporality, that our vocabulary, theories, and methods are implicitly carry linear temporal assumptions about the direction of modern politics. I mean, in Turkish politics, we used to study democratization, liberalization of civil-military relations, constitutionalization, modernization, but these all imply a certain kind of teleology, of course, end point of which is, of course, an idealized Western-inspired democracy. But this is apparently, this is becoming increasingly apparent that it's not the case. So we need other kinds of concepts to complement our analysis, to include multiple or alternative temporalities that are at work. Of course, the question becomes whether these have just recently emerged, such alternative temporalities and projections. Were they resurrected, or whether they were actually ever dead at all. So genealogical approaches, I think, are increasingly necessary to approach such questions. Without going into too much into Turkish politics, I want to bring up some issues or questions that might that might inspire further scholarship on this issue. And first thing that occurred to me when reading through the chapters in the volume is that I mean, among all these concepts, messianic rule, the nation, gendered politics, temporality, elections, and ritualization, is the recently again popularized question of populism. I mean, I have been distant to the question of populism for some time, but increasingly I'm realizing myself its applicability and utility. And I think the discussions on populism could benefit a lot from the perspectives that are in this book. Because both messianic politics, electoral politics, and different forms of political engagement we see here bear significantly on the question of populism. Basically defined, I think, as a division of nations or political communities in terms of elite and common people who are believed to be the, actual owners of the political nation. Because this somehow also fits neatly with the kind of bifurcation David Gilmartin emphasizes throughout the book, and he also talked about it in his volume, the bifurcation, the divergence or the tension between a reason, basically an enlightened notion of reason, and tradition. Because in many contexts, populism manifests itself as this, in which, and as an answer to this tension between usually secularized, liberalized elite caste and a common people who are who have been labeled as traditional, backward, or unenlightened. So in the heart of the question of populism also lies these historical tensions. So this is one question that I think still needs to be approached historically, and particularly through the lenses of cultural history. And another concept I would pay attention to is charisma. Again, I mean, this came up with our previous discussions with Arild and our religion and authoritarianism study group here at University of Oslo, that charisma, although, or charismatic authority or charismatic political leadership, might also provide us with some insight into the problems of contemporary sovereignty and its conundrums. What I realized through my initial approach to this question is that there is a division between political scientists and usually anthropologists, whereby anthropologists approach this in micro level through analysis of small communities or small-scale charismatic leadership, whereas political scientists, if they approach the question at all, usually just use charisma as a concept, as a generic concept that is not well defined. But I think even in the form that it was proposed by Weber, the concept of charisma holds a lot of promises, especially with regard to questions of messianic authority, traditional forms, and the tension between traditional practices and forms of politics and more rational, within quotes, of course, forms of political legitimation. Without further ado, I will end my comments, and I would like to thank once again both to Arild and the editors and the contributors to the volume.
Brilliant, so much here. I'm really happy that you were able to join us and give this comment. Fantastic, and of course you sort of really underlined the core idea of a lot of what Pamela has inspired us to do and to study, which is precisely this longue durée of conceptual history, cultural history. David, would you like to respond to these comments?
First, just to say great comments, and thanks to both Alp and Duncan. Really interesting, I thought. And I don't want to spend much time responding, but just one question came to mind. One of the interesting things, and this comes up a little bit in the book, is in thinking about sovereignty, has to do with, what's called political theology. That is the extent to which modern political ideas really are structured by older religious ideas about power and what legitimizes it and where authority comes from. And this first struck me in listening to Duncan's comments about the old king in Thailand. The writing on political theology that has gotten the most play is writing derived from the old work of Carl Schmitt, and really looking on the way that kingship basically is derived from visions of divinity. That is the degree to which the will of the king, the power of the king, is modeled on notions about divine power. And but what's interesting in this is the question of the degree to which the legitimacy of kingship is also linked culturally to self-restraint, to self-denial, rather than the assertion of will. And this story about the old king who never publicly interfered in politics, and yet, which was critical to his own legitimacy, the notion of him having a kind of renunciatory approach to politics, but nevertheless power working through these networks, sort of raises that question, and it's interesting to think about in terms of what Alp raised as well. When you think about populism, it's very often, or even about Erdogan and the roots of his power, but it's very often conceptualized in terms precisely of this, forceful self-direction power, emanating from a not renunciation at all, but from a very sort of forthright assertion of will, which then embodies the community. So, I mean, this is another question about just thinking about this, which really struck me in hearing your comments together. But I don't want to say more, because we should leave the time for questions. But again, thanks for those comments. They're really, really interesting.